Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Ooh, we seem to have got... Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this morning's meeting of the County Council Executive. Councillor Martin Hill, Leader of the Council and Chairman of this committee. Welcome, and I hope you all had a restful New Year's break, ready for into the fray again with proposals for our budget for the next financial year. So we'll start then, please, Rachel, with apologies for absence, please.
Thank you. We don't have any apologies for absence.
Thank you. Some of our directors are attending virtually, aren't they?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you very much. So myself and Andrew Crookham are here, and the rest of the corporate leadership team are all dialing in.
Thank you. Okay then, item 2 then. Are there any declarations of interest which a councillor wishes to make? Not seeing any, so that is dealt with. And item 3 then, announcements by any member of the executive or an executive director. Councillor Davey.
Thank you, Leader. I just wanted to update members on the Western Growth Corridor application that is going to be determined shortly by the City Council. Members will be aware that Highways have had a substantial objection to this scheme, which has been maintained now for some time. In consultation with my colleague, Councillor Davis, we have determined that this application should be referred to the Secretary of State, Michael Gove, for his discretion and determination. We don't believe that our objection can be overcome by the planning proposal documents laid for the Planning Committee. We have registered to speak as an objector to the application at the meeting next week. And as I've said, we've also taken the precautionary stance of writing to the Secretary of State, asking him to call it in for his determination. That's our position, Leader and members, and I'll leave Councillor Davis to add any further comment to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, just to echo really Councillor Davies' position, I think what we need to bear in mind is that local government has seen a number of cases where local communities have really been devastated by poor planning decisions, and I think we're at a crux with this particular development. Anybody who travels in that area of Lincoln will know that it's bedlam most of the time anyway. A combination of issues that we know both caused by railways, caused by the A46, and also the development. To allow this to go ahead in the format that's being suggested, I think is verging on negligent, because as we know, what the proposal is to do the bare minimum in order to get the most number of houses away. And my fear, and we see it elsewhere, is we'll end up with almost the worst possible outcome, where we'll see a minimum number of houses developed, a maximum number of houses developed for a minimum amount of intervention. And the much lauded promises of bridges, of sustainable bus corridors, and all of the improvements that we are demanding will never come forward. And that will compound the problems, particularly along the A46 roundabout junction and down into Lincoln that we already see. And I think for us to sit back and just accept that would be unfair. And it's not what rightly the local members want us to do, but also the wider Lincoln travelling population want us to do.
Thank you for that. Any further? I think Chief Exec, an update on coronavirus and local issues. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So the executive will be aware from the recent media reporting around the position with regard to particularly our health colleagues working across our 3 healthcare trusts, both the community, the mental health trust and the hospital trust. All 3 trusts are under significant pressure, and you will have seen that over the bank holiday, over the new year, that the hospital trust announced what we call Opal 4 in terms of a critical emergency. The challenge that all of the trusts are having relates more to business continuity and the number of staff who are off sick or self-isolating due to COVID as well as other reasons, rather than necessarily the numbers of patients who are on the wards or in intensive care with COVID. It's much more of a business continuity staffing issue. I had a briefing yesterday from all of the hospital trust and the other 2 health community trusts. All of the services are under pressure. They clearly are working under their business continuity arrangements and are asking staff to work overtime and additional hours and redeploying staff where they can. There are some minor outpatient services that have been affected, particularly across the Mental Health Trust and the Community Trust, but all of the services are up and running, but clearly on a day-to-day basis they're making some challenging decisions because of the staffing challenges that they've got. Just to say, from a Lincolnshire County Council perspective, we're obviously monitoring the staffing levels very, very closely, but pleased to report that we haven't had to invoke any business continuity plans at all, and we're coping very well at the council in terms of our delivered services. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any further? Okay then, thank you very much. We'll then move on to item 4, which were the minutes of the executive, which was held on the 7th of December. Is your wish that I sign these as a true and accurate record? Is that agreed? No amendments? Thank you. So that's dealt with. So then we move on to the main item today, which is the proposal for the council budgets for the next financial year. So just to remind you, the process is that the executive will agree or not agree. Well, whatever the executive agrees today will go out to consultation, both within the council through the scrutiny process, but also without the council in terms of public consultation. And then the executive, following that consultation, the executive will make a final recommendation to the full council. So the executive in February will make a recommendation to the full council later that month. And then obviously the full council will then debate and decide on the budget for the ensuing year. So I'll hand over now to Andrew Crookham, who will walk us through the papers or do whatever Andrew wants to do, really. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leader, and very happy to present these draft budget proposals to Executive today. So we're presenting a balanced set of proposals for the 22-23 financial year, and with provisional gaps in the 3 years thereafter of £9 million, £6 million, £7 million. As I've said at this meeting previously when we've been discussing monitoring reports, it's been a year of extraordinary cost pressures as we continue to manage the impacts of the COVID pandemic. You know, you'll see in the paper that adult social care is facing pressures of £13 million next year. A typical year would typically see about £7 to £9 million, so well in excess of normal circumstances. Looked after children, again, mentioned previously, a 10% increase during the COVID period, and we expect that to cost an additional £3 million next year and a £3 million in the 2 years thereafter. In home to school transport, we're seeing gross cost pressures of £6.5 million on the back of a £5 million increase in that budget last year related to market volatility, prices and demand, and other issues around, such as the national living wage. And pay as well, the era of the pay restraint that was announced 2 years ago, it signalled to be coming to an end by the Chancellor as well, so increasing our estimates around pay. In a departure from previous years as well, given the external environment around the cost of living crisis, we're also proposing an additional £3.5 million contingency to deal with inflationary cost pressures. You'll have seen in the press on the back of the bank rate increase in December that the Office of Budget Responsibility is expecting inflation to peak at 6%. So whilst our estimates for contracts do include inflation, there are other unknown elements that may yet impact upon us. The report also sets out a savings strategy that we're undertaking around transforming our demand-led services and reducing back-office bureaucracy, and we expect to deliver £25.5 million of new savings and income over the next 4 years, on top of the £354 million that the Council has already delivered over the last 11 years. Notable immediate examples for delivering savings include £1.3 million around the smarter working agenda, which will increase over time as we look at the properties that we use, and £1.8 million in reducing the business support function over the next 2 years. The settlement announced just before Christmas provided some welcome new funding of £17 million for the next financial year, which is included in the proposals outlined. £9.3 million was allocated for care services and £7.7 million as a one-off services grant. On the back of that one-off grant, the government has also signalled its intention to pursue the fair funding agenda next year, and we expect more on that in coming months, and naturally we will report to Executive as that agenda develops. Key issues for the government naturally will be how they square off the issue of distribution, whether that focuses on deprivation or rurality, as this council has been pursuing in previous years. On revenue, that leaves us with the council tax proposal. Members will remember that we carried forward an unused 3% adult social care precept from last year, and the proposal in the paper is to take that, which would raise £9.6 million of new income against those cost pressures of £13 million that I referred to at the start. There is a further 3% increase available to members should they wish to invest in further areas, and each 1% of council tax raises a further £3.2 million in additional revenue. I'll just briefly touch on capital as well. We've also set out an update to the 10-year capital programme, totalling 372 million, which has been profiled to account for scheduling of our various major projects, particularly the major highway schemes that we run, and to ensure that we continue to live within the means of the revenue budget that's required to support it. I'll pause there, Leader, but happy to take any comments or questions.
Thank you for that. So I suppose I'll invite comments, but I think I've got one or two questions to start with, because obviously can you just explain about the government, the Treasury gave a 3-year settlement to local government, but we are at this stage just proposing a 1-year settlement because we've only got 1 year. Can you just clarify that for everybody, please?
Yeah, that's correct, Leader. So the Chancellor announced £4.8 billion of new funding in the spending review to cover the 3 years of that period, albeit local government department has only announced 1 year of funding, and that is on the assumption that this fair funding review will come. With that will mean a different funding envelope for us. And as I said in my walkthrough, the key to what we receive going forward and what our future spending base will be dependent on whether the government pursues a deprivation-based model or one that's based on some of the other factors that we experience here around rurality and sparsity.
Government's held back some money for the fair funding review, so it will be a partial review. It won't be a full scale because there isn't enough in the financial envelope the government's left itself. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So naturally there's a natural cost of being in business, and for a council like ours, our social care provision is a key part of that. So elements of that will be protected. There will be transitional arrangements as well, and that's why the services, the one-off services grant that I referred to, is being held back for transitional arrangements. So we've not assumed any further funding for that in future years beyond 22-23.
And you also mentioned inflation, but obviously we officially, I think even the Bank of England is saying it's 5.6% or something, but I think you talk to people, most people, I think currently it's a lot higher than that. So obviously, are you confident that because the council itself will be subject to inflation, of course, and we already know in terms of contracts and all sorts of services received that we're getting a lot of pressure in terms of increased costs?
Yeah, there's been a lot of internal debate about this as we've developed the proposals before you today. So in terms of a lot of our major contracts, they are based on CPI at a particular point in time. So we know with a certain degree of certainty that we'll continue to pay those. There are some that are volatile, and that will be what the £3.5 million contingency would be there to set against. But things like energy costs, we are like homeowners, we are locked into contracts at certain points in time as well, albeit they will fall off at points in the year as well. So best estimates as it is at the moment, confident that that's okay, but naturally the external circumstances will change, and we'll be keeping a very close eye on that as the year develops.
I mean, in terms of, obviously, what you didn't mention, there's some money we put in the base budget for flood issues, which Councillor Davey will probably just like to explain, or you, because there was some money, one-off money, because I think you've always got to bear in mind with these budgets, there's a difference between one-off, which is either one-off savings or one-off whatever, reserves or whatever, as opposed to an annual in the budget. So I think we put some money in the budget for flooding, which was one-off, but so there's a proposal now to embed that at least for the next 2 years.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having problems with my mic. Yeah, that's correct, Leader. An extension of a further £1.45 million for 2 years of further expenditure of that project, which has been yielding some serious good results that I don't know whether Councillor Davey might want to expand upon, but yeah, so that will have taken that funding process over 4 years at that point.
Yes, thank you, Leader. I'm very grateful for the support of the Executive in relation to bringing this forward as part of the budget process. As you know, we've been investing in flood schemes across the county over the last 2 years with money that was allocated in the previous budget, and I'm very grateful that we've been able to find this additional funding that will be used across Lincolnshire over the next 2 years to help support flood schemes as we go forward. It is outside of potholes, one of the biggest issues we have with our residents in relation to flooding issues, and to be able to actually resolve some of these in the next 2 years will be very welcome for them and I think for the general standing of the council. Thank you, Leader.
Yeah, well, we are lead flood authority in terms of legislation. It doesn't mean to say we have to fix every flooding problem, but there are elements where we know there are persistent issues where in reality we're the only organisation who's going to do something, and I think that the money we have invested has been very welcome, particularly in those communities which have now got flood relief. So I think that's something we should, even in difficult times, we should be looking to support.
And could I add, Leader, that in investing this money now, how we can utilise their monies as well. So that money that we're putting in will actually will grow in terms of what we're able to physically spend on schemes across Lincolnshire. So I think it's not just a good thing that we're doing, but it's a good investment because it will trigger further funding from our partners.
So, and just in terms then of, there's some still unfinished business, there's some which is routine returns from the district council to, and obviously you've put a sort of an estimate in of what you think is coming, but obviously that does just vary a bit. And obviously the massive one which still hasn't been resolved is the 12 million highways maintenance grant which we are currently trying to resolve, and obviously members will be well aware of the campaign, but just to say there's been no indication as yet in terms of from the government, but there will be some minor adjustments also from the districts, Andrew.
Yeah, that's correct, Leader. So we're currently waiting to hear back from the districts on their council tax base calculations, which obviously naturally has an impact on the amount of council tax income that we set the budget requirement for, and also business rate income estimates for next year as well, which are due at the end of January. So we'll be providing an update on that and the implications that it would have on the proposals outlined at the next executive meeting.
So then, obviously, in terms of the over £12 million, obviously we had a debate at full council, which unanimously members supported the campaign to try and get that 12 million reinstated from government. We obviously have started, and we've had meetings with MPs and with the Transport Minister, Charlotte Veer, but as we haven't had the actual settlement yet, so we're not sure at this stage whether our campaign is being successful or not. That does make it very difficult for us also to set a budget, because £12 million is a large sum of money, and I think there is a general wish from the council that we don't really want to see our highways maintenance budget cut. So we all know how important that is for not just for residents and ourselves, but also for businesses and levelling up and community well-being and all sorts of things. So we expect that, well, it sometimes is late anyway, isn't it, from the Department of Transport, but we did ask when we met with Charlotte Veer when this settlement might be announced, and she wasn't able to say, which I found very disappointing, frankly. So the campaign is continuing, and we have to live in the hope that we get this 12 million, but also expect that we don't. So, of course, there is a month now of consultation, and also the executive will have to make some recommendations if that 12 million isn't forthcoming by this meeting next month, to actually make some recommendations to the council. But at this stage, I think, my opinion, we've set a reasonable budget, a balanced budget, which is finding savings, but also using some of our reserves to balance those books, which I think is the right thing to do. But obviously, if this £12 million isn't forthcoming from the government, reinstated in terms of the highways maintenance grant, I think we're going to have some very difficult decisions, and all members are going to have very difficult decisions to make in terms of what we do about that, whether we just reduce our highways maintenance by 25%, or we try and make that up. None of the options are going to be easy, but I think this proposal at this stage actually sets us in a reasonable place. We've got a baseline to work with, and let's just hope that the government does actually relent. Also, the Department of Transport, I think it needs to be quite clear here. It's quite clear it's within, I think, what we did establish when Councillor Davis and I met with the Minister. The issue sits within the Department of Transport, nowhere else, and I think it's up to them to make the choices that they do. But and I think that's where, personally, I think we need to continue the campaign, and MPs, all our MPs are continuing to support that campaign to see if we can get something changed. But it would be a devastating blow, I think, if we had to reduce our highways maintenance by 25%. We covered it last year, as members are well aware. It's one-off, but you can't keep on doing that year after year. So I don't know, Councillor Davis, but it would be quite very, very difficult to actually keep on maintaining the roads, wouldn't it?
Yeah, thank you, Leader. I was going to make that exact point, and I support what you say on it. I think the reality is it is a DFT issue. And it was, I think, perhaps the most perturbing thing about our meeting was almost the incessant focus on metropolitan areas. And it was quite concerning, candidly, that you're talking to a senior member of the government who's involved with running the Department for Transport, and had very little understanding of how Transport for London was funded, and almost no understanding of how we were funded. And I was really put out by the fact that there was almost this, you've got more than enough money, we've given you loads, it's all fine. And I think the Treasury have done a good job in terms of saying to the Department for Transport, here's your allocation, how you break it up is down to you. And really what would appear to have done is that the DFT have top-sliced the monies in order to spend it on their, some might say, whimsical projects. And what that means is that the basic potholing, which is what we're talking about, is going to lose out quite substantially. And we've made good strides, I think, over the last 3 or 4 years in terms of being more responsive, doing better quality repairs. And we are now at that kind of almost sweet spot that it's just a function of spend. We've gone from a place where we were at times not doing repairs as well as we could have done. We were doing too many temporary repairs. We're now in a much better place, but we're just not doing enough. And if we're going to have to drop down again by 25%, as the leader rightly says, then that's going to have a devastating impact on the people of Lincolnshire. But it leads on to my questions, if I may. Just wanted to kind of clarify a couple of bits on the reserves, because as you know, Andrew, this comes up every year. And I just wonder if you could give us some clarity around, I noticed the general reserve you're expecting to tweak a little bit. It sits at about 3%. I'm guessing that's not, you're not going to slice or add huge amounts to it. But I wonder if you could just talk us through the kind of the earmark reserves at a top line, just to say where you think that will be compared to where it was.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Davis. So yeah, we held a number of earmark reserves as a matter of course, as all councils do. As you rightly said, Councillor Davis, well, it's called the General Reserve. It's essentially the ultimate backstop for the council. All councils have to have one. You get judged on it as part of your audit, etc. And the council's policy, long-standing policy for that figure is for that to sit between 2.5% and 3.5% of the council's net budget, and that's currently at around about £16 million at the moment. The purpose of that reserve is to cover any unforeseen shocks that aren't covered elsewhere in your budgetary requirement or other contingencies. And as I say, is seen as it's a requirement that we need to have on our books. The other reserves that we hold in total on the balance sheet as at last September, the most recent report that came before members, a figure of around about £250 million. Now that's split into a few different chunks, if you will. The first £100 million of that is an element related to revenue grants and contributions. So a big chunk of that was related to COVID grants that we'd received last year but not spent, and another significant amount is related to better care funding, which will come in, into its fore as we progress through the care change agenda. Another significant amount, £26 million, is related to schools, which is money that we held on behalf of schools but isn't ours to spend. And the residual amount then is genuine earmarked reserves for specific purposes. We hold most notably a financial volatility reserve, which is at £44 million at the moment. That was set up very early on in the era of austerity, I guess, if we call it that, to deal with what was going to be the fair funding review. Obviously, as I said in my presentation, that still hasn't come to pass yet, though. That's held at a figure, and I'll cover two key factors why I think that should be between about 40 to 50 million pounds at the moment. Now, as I explained during my narrative around the savings strategy, we generally see making change last, or making good transformation, takes 2 to 3 years. And we generally see that as a pot of money to help us buy us time if the fair funding review goes against us. And in terms of the figure itself, we generally see alongside that that 3 to 4 year change period, a figure of around about 2 to 3% cut of our annual budget to be a sufficient amount of money. So that's the reason why, in my professional opinion, that should be around about that figure. The rest of the reserves then are around specific earmark purposes. Members set up a development fund 2 years ago in the budget to cover specific priorities. We talked about the drainage initiatives earlier, but we've also funded specific highways initiatives like the maintenance gangs and some of the access design work from that over the past few years. That review that led to that reserve, we saw a reduction of 30 reserves from the balance sheet at that point that allowed the creation of that. And then there's a number of other reserves for specific projects that we are required to hold for things like the insurance fund, for example. So hopefully that was a useful canter through the reserves.
Oh, right. Oh, it's that one. Right, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, obviously, in the part of the proposals, as you mentioned, Volatility Reserve, that will halve, estimating what will happen in the next 3 years. I mean, I think reserves is part of a discussion to be had, and that will obviously be talked about, but the question is what is readily available, and I think, as I've said at the beginning, the issue with the reserves, they are a one-off, and as a point of principle in terms of sound budgeting, you don't use reserves just to balance your books. Reserves can be used for one-off items, but in terms of whether you do that just to constantly plug the gap, that is the road to Nottingham City, if you like, where they are currently under a Section 1. But there certainly needs to be a discussion about what reserves and what is legitimately available. But again, it is only a one-off solution, a yearly solution. So, but certainly that needs to be, and we will, as an executive, look at what is held and how that will move in the future. But quite clearly, my view is, just using reserves to balance revenue spending is not something I would recommend on a regular basis, and it would also remove any flexibility. For example, last year we were able to put £10 million back into, or £12 million back into highways maintenance, and another £10 million to support businesses. So you do need some reserves to give you the flexibility to enable the council to do stuff, get projects going, and because all these things require match funding. So certainly that will be part of the conversation, I'm sure, because there are very few areas where you can go to make up shortfalls. Basically, it's either using reserves, putting your council tax up, finding savings, and those are your choices, really, and that never changes. But certainly that could be part of it. Let's hope we get to the stage where we get the money from the government. If we don't, obviously all options will need to be considered. Yes, certainly.
Yeah, I'd completely agree with that. I think the idea that we can just spend our reserves is ludicrous and dangerous, isn't it? We all know where that we'd end up. Just the 2 points I make. I think in terms of the presentation of this, when we go out to the consultation, I'm acutely aware that every year I've been a councillor, the response is, oh, they've got £250 million in reserve, or whatever the figure is. They don't need to put council tax up because of this, this and this. And I think we need to be kind of almost double stated what the position of the reserves is, so that doesn't come back to haunt us. And I think actually, if you're running your own home or your own business, to only have 3%, for example, in the general reserve is a tiny amount of money in the scheme of things, £16 million for unexpected things. And it makes perfect sense to me that we do earmark a reserve against financial volatility, because we know that is a real clear and present risk that we sit through at the moment. And I think, Martin, you've just clarified the point that in terms of the 3-year proposals, this would see the financial volatility reserve halved, which is quite a dramatic situation that takes us from kind of 45 to, say, 22, something like that. So all of a sudden, the idea that we can plug the 12.5 million gap just from reserves alone, I don't think at this stage stacks up, but it will be interesting to see what comes back from the consultation in terms of partners and the public as to what they think of that. But I would just echo that it's all about the presentation. So we make sure that perhaps, and not naming names perhaps, but people who should know better in the wider political circles in Lincolnshire have often said, oh, well, they don't need extra money because they've got all this money in reserves. And I think we just need to hammer home what the real position is, because it's not fair to the public if they're misrepresented. Thank you.
Yeah, I think dead right. I mean, certainly Department of Transport, I'm sure, are saying we'll just use the reserves, which, frankly, if we run councils like certain departments of government ran themselves, I think we'd be quite concerned. I think there's a valid point there. I mean, I think, for example, part of the issue, you did mention some of these earmark reserves, but money we get from government to do stuff, which obviously we put in the earmark reserve. So I suppose the big one at the moment is the coronavirus, or whatever it's called. Can you just say, because obviously we will be spending all that money, but obviously can you just run through, perhaps Debbie can run through, the money's there, but obviously there's quite an audit of what we're doing with it, and we have to be showing to government that we are spending that money on health matters.
Yes, thank you, Leader. So I'll make a start, and then I'm sure Andrew will want to pitch in with some of the detail afterwards. So we've received a number of grants from government over the last sort of year and a bit to support us to be able to support our communities. Some of them are relatively open in terms of terms and conditions, and some of them are very specific. So some of the specific terms and conditions relate to workforce grants that need to be distributed to our providers of adult social care, both home care and also the residential sector. We continue to give out those grants, and as you say, although we've got money in reserves, we expect for some months to come for us to continue to be able to support the sector in terms of workforce. Now, as I've said at the beginning of the announcements, clearly there are challenges around workforce, particularly in relation to business continuity, and whilst we're coping at this moment in time, clearly the residential sector for adult social care and the home care sector are undoubtedly under pressure, and therefore are utilising those workforce grants to be able to support their staff doing overtime, to be able to provide mutual aid to one another, to look at recruitment and retention and all sorts of a range of things to be able to make sure that home care packages can continue to be provided for our vulnerable communities. We also recognise that the pandemic has had a significant impact on children and young people, not least the impact in terms of the numbers of children that we have needed to put into specific placements rather than our own in-house foster carers. At the beginning of the pandemic, clearly a number of our foster carers were shielding and were unable to be able to provide continuity of placements and new placements for children who needed to be looked after, and therefore we've had to use a number of external placements. Whilst we've got a plan to be able to bring those young people back into the county, disrupting children's placements and education is something that needs to be well thought through. So we've got a 3-year trajectory in order to be able to resettle those children back into county, into local schools and with local foster carers. So again, the challenges around the coronavirus and being able to get back to almost a sort of business as usual isn't something that's going to happen overnight, and therefore the trajectory is that those coronavirus grants will be spent over the coming months and the coming years in order for us to be able to get back into a business as usual sort of position. I don't know whether Andrew wants to add to that.
It's just to provide some context to the numbers as well. I think if you recall the monitoring report that we had for the year end, I think we spent well in excess of £100 million on coronavirus response during the 2021 financial year. Some of the figures I quoted just to Councillor Davis a second ago, there's a big slug of that is that coronavirus grant that we'd received in the year but not yet spent, but which has been subsequently spent and which we'll be reporting back to you when we do the quarter 3 report in February time. So naturally happy to keep on reporting back on how the progress is going about that. And coming back to Councillor Davis's response, absolutely take that on board about the presentation. I think as accountants we naturally fall into the financial reporting tells us to report like this, and I think we can be a bit more savvy about how we present things. So I completely agree with you.
Yeah, so I mean, we have to quarterly report. We're quite rightly, the government says, well, we're giving you 100 million, you say, in this one financial year, which is a lot of money, and quite rightly they're saying, well, we want to know what you're spending it on, and which is what we're doing, and that all is going on social care basically, and other costs, legitimate costs for the pandemic. I think, you know, I think it's fair to say, although we've very unhappy with the Department of Transport, I have to say in terms of the government as a whole, first of all, they have given us a lot of money, all local governments have a lot of money to deal with the coronavirus, and that should be acknowledged, that huge sums of money have been given across the country, but also to local government. And also the settlement they got from the Treasury this year was, although it's still challenging and we've still got issues about funding social care, and there's pressures which probably aren't being properly recognised, I think we should acknowledge also that the general settlement was better than we expected, which should be acknowledged. But that doesn't mean to say that the two main issues of what the Department of Transport is choosing to do, and also the government really needs to get a proper grip on how it's going to fund social care in the future. And, you know, it's regrettable that we're still in this phase of, well, you can put council tax up a bit more every year, which I think everybody accepts isn't the best way of resolving that problem. But I think we should acknowledge, although we're very cross with the Department of Transport, that does not mean we're particularly cross across the board. I think Councillor Bradwell, you want to come in?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Well, actually, a lot of what I was going to say has been said, but I think it is very disappointing that we've only been given a one-year budget, because actually, you know, we can do no planning for years 2 and 3, which we've normally worked when we've been setting budgets in the past. We will have had a long-term view about where we need to be for services, and you know, and how we're going to invest to improve. So I think it is very difficult for us. And I have to say, I've been on the council a number of years now, and I don't think I've ever known adult care being such a problem with residential and home care. You know, we've always, you know, been able to fund those activities. We've got good contracts with both residential care sector and the home care sector. But obviously COVID and the fact that it's very much like the hospital, lots of people are off with COVID, and actually those people still need visits. So I think, you know, we are in a place which we've never seen before with providing services, and we've mentioned children who are in care, but again, you know, people, the foster carers have got COVID, and so therefore we've had to place children on many occasions out of county. So I do think we're in a position which we've never had before, and obviously we've talked about roads, and roads are very precious to our residents. When you talk to residents, when you go to parish council meetings, you know, roads are the main thing that I get asked every month. You know, there's always something, or like Colleen's mentioned, flooding, there is always something to do with the roads and that. So, you know, again, it would be very difficult for us to actually reduce that budget, but as we've listened to the stories about, you know, we just haven't got the funding, extra funding to fund those. So I do think we're in a very difficult position, and I would support giving the 3% adult care precept this year, because I really do feel that we do need it for those services, because we do have a duty to actually look after people who require the care. So, you know, that's really all I want to say. But I am very disappointed that, you know, we have only got this 1 year settlement again, which does leave us, you know, wondering what's going to happen next year. There's no planning that we can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So, yeah, Councillor Davey.
Thanks, Leader. Just a few thoughts and then a couple of questions. I Firstly, I want to touch on the general reserves and reserve matters. I agree with you and Councillor Davis that it would be absolute folly to spend all of our reserves to deal with matters. We need a general healthy reserve so we can do things like invest in business support, which is what we did. And we've helped over 1,000 businesses now with that money that was allocated in the last budget. Businesses that weren't getting any support through the government district-led packages. So we've actually kept businesses going. We've invested in businesses for the future. So I would want to maintain a good, healthy reserve in the future so we can make those one-off decisions that helps Lincolnshire's economy grow and supports the wider growth of Lincolnshire. So I'm fully supportive. On the highways issue, now we've seemed to have identified that the issue really belongs in the Department for Transport and not with Treasury. And then I would hope that after your meeting with the Transport Minister, that you'll write to all the MPs, updating them on that meeting and requesting that they go and see the Secretary of State within the next 4 weeks to make that case much, much louder, that they need to deal with this matter, not just for Lincolnshire, but for all rural areas that are equally deprived of funding for their road network. It's simply not right that people who live in cities who already have more money spent per head on them get, we end up with our residents having an even deeper cut into that. That's not right, and we need to be very vociferous about that, and we need our MPs to stand up for Lincolnshire on this matter. So I'd hope, Leader, you'll write further in that regard. Just a question for Andrew, in terms of business rate collection in the last year, is there any indication of any shortfall in business rate collection? Bearing in mind COVID and all the challenges that businesses have had, and what will that look like if it turns out to be underline or overline or wherever it is, and what the future might look like. I think all of us have walked down the high street in Lincoln, we see lots of empty shops. Empty shops means no business rates. So what does that would look like in the future? I think for me, cost pressures are critical, and employment levels are going to be a challenge. Yesterday's American employment data showed 4.5 million people resigned from their jobs in the last 3 months. Do we have any indication of that happening in our areas, of people just saying that's enough, I can't take any more? We hear about it constantly in the media around NHS staff just saying that they've reached the end of the line, they can't do any more. They feel so exhausted by it all. Are we going to put ourselves in a position where workforce in the public sector walks away? And if so, what does that look like in terms of risk for us going forward? And in terms of the one-off grant money we've received, are there any indications that we might get some extra responsibilities that we don't know about yet, particularly around the Environment Act, that we actually might have to spend that money on, even though we don't yet know about it? So just what kind of risk analysis do we have for those kind of areas?
Okay, thanks, Councillor Davey. I'll start with the business rates question. So obviously it's a district council function in terms of the collection of those rates. We're not hearing anything specifically alarming about collection rates. Naturally the take from business rates is a bit lower than it would be in normal times, albeit the government has compensated for that via some compensation grants around collection. So obviously more on that at the next meeting, I think, when we bring back those figures, but nothing, as I say, nothing alarming. I think the bigger thing for us really as a council is the current funding system related to that just doesn't work. And I'm happy to say that out on camera, because I don't think it's a particularly helpful system, and I'm hoping that the government sees that as well as they progress through this fair funding agenda. In terms of employment, I think we talked about this at previous meetings, naturally keeping a very keen eye on it as a management team in terms of attracting and retaining the best talent for the council. No mass swathes of people resigning from our own council yet, albeit we are experiencing challenges in particular sectors, particularly the care sector locally, as we've discussed previously. And then the last question on hidden things. There is the new burden funding regime in place. So if there are new powers coming down to the council, the government is incumbent to provide new burdens funding for things like that. As part of the most recent settlement, there were a couple of additional items related to new funding, new burdens funding around the changes in the audit market, cyber security, and changes to what was the Troubled Families programme. So the settlement contained things that we knew were to be new burdens. So one would expect if the Environment Act, for example, was to present more responsibilities to us, that we would get funding forthcoming for that as well.
I think you're correct to raise that last point, because we all know what happens is the other government departments come in with additional responsibilities, and I think the Environment Act is going to be a classic one. There's going to be a lot of stuff in there which will bring costs onto the council, and I think the government's reasonable response might be, well, we're giving you extra money in our general settlement and it's all covered there. So it's, you know, obviously those of us who've been doing these budgets for years, this always happens, and there's some, you know, there's some gremlins in the system which you don't, people aren't aware of till probably later in the year, and we just have to get on and deliver that. So I think that's a fair comment. I think in terms of your question about the lobbying of the MPs, I mean, 5 of the 7 Lincolnshire MPs were present with Councillor Davis and myself when we met the Transport Minister, who I have to say was a very disappointing meeting in terms of responses we got. Couldn't even tell us when the settlement would be for the for highways maintenance, and frankly it was somebody who lives in London and was trying to tell us how hard it was, you know, in London for delivering transport, and how we, Councillor Davis and I, managed to not say anything, I don't know, because I thought that was the most outrageous statement I've ever heard. When the spend in London per head of population on roads is it 10 times higher than ours? I can't remember, huge amounts. So, yeah, so I mean, to actually say that, you know, we're really struggling in London, it was just gives you a problem with the mindset. So I think, speaking to MPs afterwards, I think the view is that Grant Shapps is probably the best person to approach now in terms of who is the, obviously, Secretary of State, is the person we need to go to say, at the very least, that to make the case, and MPs I know are up for that, to say, look, we're not going to just do that. And as we know, and I think Carl McCartney in particular has asked 2 questions in the House now, other counts, and I think we have been questions to various ministers, and as Councillor Davis said, I think the one where I think my MP, Gareth Davis, asked the Leader of the House, and he made it very clear that it wasn't an issue for the Treasury, it was an issue for decisions within the Department of Transport. So to me, that's where we need to be putting our campaign, and the Treasury quite reasonably saying, well, you know, we've given you the money, you know, given you a generous settlement, and really it's within that. So I think the campaign, that's where the campaign needs to be focused, and we'll continue to work with MPs to try and get some sort of resolution. At the very least, we, you know, it will, if we don't get satisfaction this year, hopefully it will be in the memory banks for future years. But and it's not something specific to Lincolnshire either. The whole of the highways maintenance grant across the country was cut by 25%, which to me is a very short-sighted decision. Government have increased it recently, and then to reduce it back again. And as Councillor Davis says, that I think we're in quite a good place now, and it would be such a tragedy if it was all thrown away. Because I mean, highways maintenance isn't very glamorous. I mean, it's not. You won't get any ministers to buy a filled pothole, will you? Because it's not really that exciting. But it's a basic service that we, you know, as a government, have a responsibility to do, and we do our best. And it's something we need to carry on doing. So, have a Councillor Woolley.
Completely concur with my colleagues around the reserves. Just look where we would have been if we hadn't have been prudent in the past with those reserves, and where we would have had to find that 12 million at effectively was very, very short notice. So the point that Councillor Davis was making around making sure that our residents are clear on the way that we use the reserves and the amount that's there, we really do need to spell out. The other point I just wanted to check with you, Andrew, on my page 42, it's under cost pressures. It's highways asset management, which is the penultimate point. Are you there yet? Page 42. I think it's the, as I say, it's the appendix with the cost pressures on. Well, if I just read it out and then, you know, you can come back to it later. Contract inflation, cost of plant, labour and equipment outstripping budgetary increases, 4% spike expected. That sounds, 4% sounds incredibly low in the present situation, and I do just wonder whether, bearing in mind that it's £750,000 and more, whether that figure should be revisited, or are you very comfortable that I've not seen 4% mentioned anywhere else? I've seen larger percentage figures mentioned, and I wondered whether that was correct or not.
I might need to ask Andy to come in and help me with the answer. We have looked at all of these in depth and revisited them on a number of occasions as well. So at the point we were pulling the paper together, it obviously the assumptions behind it, you know, debated as correct. But that, again, that's the reason why we've recommended to a certain degree that a contingency for where things are, where there are variances as we get into April and onwards. That there's an expectation that some of that may cover things where the reality is different to what the assessment was at the time. I know some of the highways. Again, some of the highways contract figures were locked in at particular points as well, related to contract price inflation as well. Typically is the September or the October figure, so that might be one of them. But I'd either defer to Andy, or if not, we'd come back in with some sort of written response about the particular item.
Are you there, Andy?
Yeah. Sorry, Councillor Hill. Yeah, just to sort of confirm Andrew's sort of statement there is, like, we continue to keep things under review. We continue to have ongoing conversations and discussions with our contractors. It is a movable feast, and there are risks associated with how the market is continuing to change, whether there are specific issues about particular material supplies, ongoing pressures that contractors are having to absorb as well. The best we can say is, as I say, we're maintaining a watching brief, and we'll continue to report back accordingly if there are any other significant variations. The figures that are included in the budget papers are the best estimate based on the best information that we had at the particular moment in time when the papers were being pulled together.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, any further comments and questions? So I think, as Councillor Woody just highlighted, behind all this there is a lot of information in terms of justifications for the cost pressures and explanations of the savings, and obviously it will go through the scrutiny process where each scrutiny committee will look at its own area and obviously cross-examine the assumptions made in that, and also obviously when it goes out to wider publication, obviously we will be asked questions. I mean, I think, you know, we've had the reserves is an issue, and I think it's right that we discussed it. And I don't want to go with the fact we're saying that they're sort of somehow sacrosanct. I think it is legitimate, they are looked at, and as part of the month, I think the executive, and I think we are thinking of having probably a member session so that any issues that members want to raise in terms of questions they have outside of the Scrutiny Commission, we probably have a special sort of, what we call it, a training meeting, and a refresh meeting, just to, and especially we've got a lot of new members, and as we know, local government finance is takes a while to get your head around it, shall we say. It's a strange old beast, but, you know, it is right. We ought to look at the reserves and, you know, really make sure that that no more can be taken out for whatever purpose. But at the same time, I think we're agreeing that we have to have reserves, but that doesn't mean to say, like everything else, they shouldn't be subject to a scrutiny, shall we say, in terms of that. So I think that's part of it. So unless anybody else has got any questions, I will move to the recommendations, which are, let me find them, on the front page, which is when I get there, excuse me. So the recommendations are on obviously page 13. So there are 5 recommendations there, which basically we agree the recommendations set out in in the proposals there, 1 to 5. Is that, and obviously then it will go to consultation. So all those in favour of those recommendations, please show. I think it's the best way of going forward. Right, okay, I think that's unanimous. Okay, so thank you very much. That agreed then, and we'll wait the next, I think it's going to be a very interesting month in terms of where we go with the budget. Okay, I think, Nigel, that's it, isn't it? Is there anything else at the end of the meeting? Right, okay, well, thank you very much for attendance, ladies and gentlemen, councillors, and welcome back to the council.